Hello everybody. I'm going to do my brief video of our review for exam number 2. As we mentioned in class the other day, your exam number 2 is located in this week's module, so it goes through the chapters and the different concepts that I'd like you to be familiar with from the chapters. The first one is the chapter that we're talking about is chapter 7, suicide and self-harm. And so what I'd like you to look at from this chapter are some of the social factors around suicide and some of the situational factors around suicide. This information can also be found in the book and in the slideshow. But some of the social factors around suicide, we talked about some differences in the social classes. And while it might sometimes seem like the lower classes might experience more social stress and issues that cause them angst and, maybe greater extent of mental health crises, there is something to be said for the upper classes who talk about, that we see potentially higher rates of suicide sometimes because you will see people that tend to be, as the book puts it, sort of falling further, that their economic losses hit them a little bit harder than people who don't have as much wealth or economic stability, that are already living that way, and it's very hard for the upper classes to cope with their new reality. So sometimes that is a factor there in terms of their loss. Sometimes we see phenomenal amount of stress associated with certain positions that we see more upper class individuals engaging in or having those jobs that have to do with, big, powerful finance jobs, business jobs, where there's a lot at risk. Sometimes they're at fault for things that are at risk, and sometimes that puts them at greater risk for potentially ending their life because of the stress from their job. So that's another form of social stress, but we see it with different layers within the different groups in our system. Another social factor in suicide, we can talk about Durkheim, who did the suicide studies in several different countries and was really talking about our connections to groups in society. The more cohesive the society is, the more stable the society is, the more people feel connected to society, the lower the suicide rate generally tends to be. So we see, lower rates overall in countries that have economic stability, political stability, that don't live in chaos, that have a good structure to their criminal justice system where people feel safe, people feel secure in general. So that's an important factor. You can also look at individual groups in society and the ties that people have to them, and that we see the stronger or more connections that people have to groups in society, the better they tend to feel about themselves, the more connections they have, the more cohesiveness they have, and so they feel a part of something. And that really helps to lower risk for suicide in some areas. We talked about certain groups like suicide bombers and some of the dynamics with suicide bombers within their societies. Generally, suicide bombers come from societies that are not stable, that don't have some of the stability that I just talked about with, more modern industrialized societies. They're very young, usually men, most of the time men, usually from, middle-class families, well-off middle-class families. They usually have a decent education within that society. They do not consider themselves terrorists. They consider themselves martyrs. And a lot of times in these societies, you do not see other means of being able to prove your point in a certain way. They don't have strong militaries. They don't have the same military type weapons or tanks or, any sort of, machinery or airplanes that can drop bombs in areas. They don't have those capabilities. So their only way to make their point and make a statement in society is to engage in these suicide bombing attacks, and that gets their message across to the groups or people in society that they feel have wronged them, or they're trying to send a message, a greater message to, other parts of the world. Suicide by cop is something that is mentioned as well. If these are dynamics where you have someone that will intentionally create a situation where the police are chasing them, trying to apprehend them, and that they put themselves in a position to be killed by the police. There is an interesting psychological component to this, as opposed to someone taking their own life. Making it the responsibility of someone else sometimes is a little bit easier. Sometimes there's a little bit more of a martyr component to that. Sometimes there may be a punishment or a blame that they want to assess to the police. So that's kind of an important piece too. So those are some of the social factors within suicide. Some of the situational factors in suicide can be many different groups in society. Talked about going through adolescence and how challenging it is to be a teenager and going through puberty and adolescence and all the changes, the pressure of school, academics, different expectations that are put out there for you. Sometimes there are issues within someone's family, abuse, neglect, lack of any sort of family structure. Sometimes having a connection or not to a religion can be a bit of a risk factor that adolescents also need a connection to something, a greater power, something more spiritual, things like that. We know more recently we see an uptick in diagnoses of mental health conditions and potentially medications, sometimes over medications. Sometimes antidepressant, anti-anxiety medications can have an opposite unintended effect where it makes people experience suicidal thoughts to a greater extent. Another situational factor would be prison. We know prison rates, it's the leading cause of death for inmates in prison. Many people feel like they've lost all hope, where they have lost their freedoms. They feel completely, helpless, hopeless, that there's nothing they can do. There really is the prison structure that kind of lacks any meaningful relationships. They usually have a disconnection from their families and friends. And so sadly, it becomes a reality. And many inmates on a regular basis are put on a suicide watch because of all of these components. Another group sadly would be college students, similar to what we talked about, I just mentioned going through adolescence, the pressure, the stress to succeed, the academic rigor that we see within higher education institutions, kind of keeping up with all the demands of higher education and all of the different things that go on college campuses. Sometimes people have a lack of social support, social ties, have a hard time, acclimating to this very large culture shock and all of the changes to their system. And so sometimes that becomes very triggering, and people do fall into having suicidal thoughts or committing suicide. Military, sometimes we see suicide rates higher for military members, especially when they return home from an active deployment, how things have shifted with them, what they have experienced being abroad or being, deployed somewhere, whether they were in active, wartime areas or not. But a lot can shift for them psychologically. A lot can shift for them physically. Sometimes they come home injured, having all of, sorts of physical and mental trauma that might not be tended to appropriately. Sometimes family dynamics can shift while they're gone as well. So it can be really hard to reacclimate to society. And that's a problem. There's also not a lot of support within our military units within the Veterans Administration, where they promote a lot of wanting to help and grateful for all the service of our veterans, but there's not a lot of support when they come home, and they're almost shamed if they ask for help, and it looks as like a sign of weakness. And if you're part of the military, you can't show a sign of weakness. In particular, men aren't supposed to show weakness. So all of those sort of social phenomena come together, and sadly, sometimes we do see people within the military who take their own lives because of these issues. And it's an unfortunate reality. There's also people who might have a life-changing diagnosis that sometimes think there is, no other way out. Sometimes this falls into the lines of it truly is a terminal diagnosis and there's not much time left for them. It could fall into an assisted suicide. But sometimes it might not be a terminal diagnosis, but it's enough for someone to think that their life is permanently altered, and they feel kind of helpless and full of despair, and they don't want to go on. So sometimes things like that are affected as well. The next topic, mental health. So under mental health, thinking about functional disorders. So we talked about organic disorders and functional disorders, where organic disorders are more of the trauma associated with like a brain trauma, usually having to do with some sort of brain damage from an accident, from drug use, from maybe some virus or something like that. The functional disorders are much more common than organic disorders, and they really come from social causes, socialization, social stress, things like that, or they're psychological. There's a psychological component there. Sometimes there's a combination. And under functional disorders, we talked about 3 general categories. We talked about psychosis, where people who have a form of psychosis are completely out of touch with reality. They are unable to recognize or distinguish reality. We talked about people with bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, manic type disorders. Those would all fall in that category. Lots of different treatment options available for people there, but it can be, that distance from reality can sometimes really have an effect on people and their relationships and their actions and behaviors. Sometimes we see criminal activity that plays out here, and people might be, unaware or unable to distinguish right from wrong, reality, or not. So that can be very dangerous. The second category of functional disorders is neurosis. And this is where people are in touch with reality, but they don't like it, so they tend to ignore it or deny it. There's a lot of excessive worry. There's a lot of excessive fear and stress within this category. And it's just easier to kind of brush it aside, to suppress it or repress it, because it's easier to deal with that. Many of us don't want to deal with reality sometimes, and we make that conscious choice. It doesn't mean that we have a formal neurosis, but sometimes that's where our brains go to try to help us deal with things. Some examples under this category tend to be the obsessive compulsive disorders, tend to be anxiety disorders, phobias, depressive disorders, things like that. So very common, I would say. This happens to many people that would fall into these categories. Very treatable. Very, easy to, I don't want to say easy, very, it is possible to maintain a very healthy, stable life, working and having families and all, and managing a disorder that falls under neuroses. The third category, the third type of functional disorder are personality disorders. And these are characterized by different perceptions, feelings, sort of distorted beliefs, distorted reality. Sometimes there's more of extreme, the like a disregard for the rules of society, breaking the law, breaking the rules. There can be a lack of moral development. So this could be different personality disorders. Borderline, antisocial. We talked about narcissistic personality disorder. They can all fall into this category. Again, very treatable overall, but can pose problems with individuals, with their relationships, things like that. So concerns here, obviously, for some issues that fall in this category of mental health. And then we talked a little bit about different models to explain some of these mental health disorders. And so the psychosocial models actually deal with like the psychoanalytic theory that we talked about, the id, the ego, and the superego, and how they play a role in our decisions. And our id is our, attention seeker and pleasure seeker, and how it balances out. And a lot of the psychoanalytic theories center around experiences when we were younger and relationships with, adults or opposite sex adults, and how that transforms us as we get older. And so, according to this theory, it would explain mental health and mental health disorders as some sort of repressed memory, emotion from when you were younger that you weren't successfully able to navigate certain stages of your life, and how it manifests itself at a later point as maybe a mental health condition. And so there's a lot, when we talked about repressed feelings and memories and how our brain protects us, a lot of that does fall into this psychoanalytic theory. Another psychosocial theory has to do with social stress. And this really talks about a lot of the stress that comes at us on a regular basis. We can get stress from school, we can get stress from work, we can get stress from families. We could be talking about regular normal activities that we go through every day. We could be talking about situations like divorce. We could be talking about job loss, or maybe, again, like a diagnosis that's really challenging. And so it really talks about how people manage this stress. Do people have adequate coping mechanisms? When we don't have adequate coping mechanisms, we can't manage the emotions, we can't manage the stress, and then we start to kind of steamroll downward. When we have more adequate coping mechanisms, which is something we can all work on, or certainly can be worked on in therapy, that is when we start to see people able to deal with the reality of some of these challenging moments in life, this social stress, like, okay, I acknowledge this, and then this is how I'm going to deal with it. This is how it manifests itself in me, and people can move forward. So it kind of is about recognizing our different emotions and feelings and acknowledging them and understanding that while things might be hard, this is how I'm going to try to deal with it and move forward. So that's the other sort of social stress theory about how we can try to manage that. Heterosexual deviance is the next chapter. We talked a lot about polygamous relationships, polygamous marriages, open marriages. So understanding the dynamics of a polygamous relationship is one, husband or wife having multiple husbands or wives, like illegal marriages, where it is very much the norm in some societies. In our society, it is illegal to have more than one husband or wife at any given time, a legal marriage. A lot of it has to do with sort of the morality of the whole idea. Some thoughts that really came from maybe older religious teachings, but then it has a lot to do in current day, a more modern take on that law has to do with fraud and, all of the tax benefits or death benefits or insurance issues or benefits that come from being married to someone else. And so a lot of it has to do with that bottom line of money. So understanding some of the dynamics of why people would want to get involved with more than one husband or wife. Open marriages, we talked a lot about some of the deviance of open marriages and what the expectation there is. It the same as polygamy or not? So understanding some of these dynamics. And we even talked a little bit about swingers. Doesn't necessarily have to be married, but there are couples that are married that are swingers with other couples and things like that. So thinking about, just the ideas of deviance around those different behaviors. And then we also, under heterosexual deviance, talked about prostitution. And so some of the theories of prostitution have to do with like functionalism. Functionalists would talk about kind of sexual morality, how it falls into play in a social institution. Talking about the functionalness of these social institutions, and prostitution is certainly one of the oldest occupations that we know of, within thousands of years. But functionalists talk about why it works for society and how it is a job, and it is something, people choose. Sometimes they're forced into it, but kind of how it's a social institution in and of itself, and that's important for society. The social psychological theory talks about some of the, my computer just went off. Some of the social factors that contribute to people becoming a prostitute. It could be a detachment from society. It could be coming from an abusive household. It could be thinking that is, all you're worth if maybe you haven't been treated well in your life and maybe you need an outlet, or it's just something to kind of take you out of your mind space. So there's a lot of sort of psychological components there where people can kind of detach. And there's a lot of people who will talk about prostitution, and when they are engaging in that, they kind of take themselves out of that moment because it's kind of how they mentally protect themselves. So that's a social psychological theory. The oppression theory really talks about the systemic oppression of women and how historically we've lived in very patriarchal times. Men have dominated women historically, and how women continue to be treated that way, and prostitution is just another manifestation of that. Another theory for prostitution would be an empowerment theory, that some women choose that this is empowering. I'm making this choice for myself. This is my career, or maybe it's just my job, but I'm making money, and it brings them gratification, where maybe it builds up their self-esteem if they make a lot of money doing it, or they feel good about actually making their own choice, as opposed to maybe other times in their life where people have made choices for them. So it goes to empowerment, which is supposed to be a positive theory, even though we know that prostitution can often end in violence or abuse of women anyway. But it's supposed to be a positive theory, whereas the oppression theory is more of like a negative association with society and a theory. I think those are probably the important ones to think about in terms of theories of prostitution. Next chapter is targets of stigma. And we just talked about this last week. So thinking about the graphs that we put on the board when you met with your groups, we talked about homophobia and sort of the fear of same-sex couples, same-sex relationships, different sexual orientation, sort of anti-gay, kind of mindset that people have. And then you listed as groups, you listed a lot of the targeted groups in society and what the stigma was associated with them. So I want you to think about what we talked about in class, what was put on the board, the different groups. We talked about people with disabilities. We talked about people with different weight. We talked about people of color. We talked about different ethnic backgrounds. Obviously, we talked about the LGBTQ plus community. So all of those groups that are historically considered maybe minority groups, the oppressed groups in society, there's a lot of prejudice and discrimination that's levied against those groups, what the stigmas are with those groups. So thinking about those ideas and the significance of those stigmas. And then the last chapter that we got to the other day was internet deviance, and talking about the different types of internet deviance, all having to do with computers and technology, and the different examples we went through also on the slideshow. Some of the dangers of cyber deviance. We talked about identity theft, which is very hard to recover from. Obviously, the online scams that can take your money, so there's money loss there. We talked a little bit about, we got a little bit into kind of gaming, meeting people online dating. That can be dangerous if you meet up with someone who is posing, is not really who they say they are, and they are just more of a predator. Online stalking can be very dangerous when that stalker shows up in real life. So there can be these dangers with all of these different types of relationship online, not just, sort of taking your money, but also could be harming you physically if they are someone that is dangerous or criminal and they come, looking for you, or you end up meeting them for a date, something like that. So it's risky when we are relating to people who are on the other end of a computer and we don't really know who they are or what they're about. So there's a lot of dangers with these types of cyber deviance, cyber crimes. As we mentioned in class, there are quite a few people, quite a few intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, not just in our country, but around the world, that spend all day, every day working on these cyber crimes, because it's very hard to keep up with the technology, with the cyber criminal, with tracing people around the world. And so this is a big challenge for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. All right, that wasn't as quick as I thought, but if you have any questions, please send me an email. So the test, as a reminder, will be on Monday during class time. I will send a reminder email on Sunday with your code to get into it. It will be in next week's module. It will be taken the same way, same rules as the first exam. We are not meeting in class in the classroom. You will be taking this on your computer from the privacy of your own bedroom or living room or kitchen or wherever, library, wherever you want to be. So don't show up to class, but be ready during class time to take the exam. All right? Have a nice weekend, everybody.